Hello, and welcome once again to Neurologic. I'm your host, Leo Jones. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Over 4 months, if I recall correctly. I'm still grieving in some ways over the death of my mom, but life has slowly gotten better as time continues to pass. Not having her around is painful, sometimes more than others, but I'm coping in my own way. I write letters to her and save them, an exercise that allows me to, at the very least, depressurize some of the feelings that I have and give them structure. Perhaps someday I'll read them to you or post them, but for now, it's something that is only between me and my mom. Today, though, I want to talk to you about seclusion, segregation, surveillance, and registries. Efforts to quarantine, separate, record, and monitor autistics living today and in the future. You may have heard about such efforts in various communities, tied to problematic encounters with police officers and security personnel, where the autistic person ends up attacked, accosted, or even arrested for, being autistic. Now, in some cases, this has resulted in positive efforts to train and educate authorities to understand and respond properly to autistic individuals, at many times led by autistics themselves. However, as of late, there have been significant rumblings surrounding the idea of a national registry of autistic individuals. I talked about this as well as intentional communities in the last episode called Autistics Can't Be Astronauts, so today I might overlap a bit. In some areas, there have been laws passed to establish such registries or databases that would allow for law enforcement, as well as emergency personnel, to access this information. The end goal being that it would prevent accidental shootings or unnecessary action when encountering an autistic person. So far, such registries or databases are voluntary, a major part due to the fact that their existence could be in violation of HIPAA and other privacy laws. However, for some autistics, their caregivers may not give them a choice, especially as children. Let's start with an example of a situation that registries or databases are supposed to prevent. Back on July 17, 2017, 14-year-old Connor Leibel was at the park, feeling overwhelmed and trying to stim to relieve his anxiety and stress. Minding his own business, not bothering anyone. From the article. But that's not what it looked like to Officer David Grossman. Grossman said he thought Leibel was bringing his hands towards his mouth to somehow inhale drugs. After driving by multiple times, Grossman stopped to ask Leibel what he was doing. "I'm stimming," Leibel replied, taking a few jerking steps back. Footage of the July 19, 2017 incident captured by Grossman's body cam shows. Grossman apparently didn't know what that meant. He told Leibel to stop walking away, while Leibel, confused, told him, "It's a string." After the teen awkwardly told the officer he didn't have identification on him, Grossman grabbed his arm and tried to restrain him. In a blur of fast movements that are difficult to distinguish in the footage, the pair hit a tree and fall to the ground, and the camera captures Grossman struggling to pin down the teen, while Leibel, his breaking voice rising in increasing panic, repeatedly screamed, "I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay," as the policeman on top of him tells him to stop moving and relax. Moments later, when Diane Craglow, Leibel's caretaker, arrived at the scene, she told the officer that the boy was autistic. As she looked on in horror, Leibel, his voice trembling, asked her, "Am I going to be okay?" Craglow tried to explain to the heavy-breathing policeman that he was stimming, to which Grossman replied, "Yeah, I don't know what that is," while Leibel continued to struggle beneath him. After speaking with the caretaker, Grossman began to soften and de-escalate the situation. He dropped a pair of handcuffs to the ground and stood up to release Leibel, but the damage had already been done. In that article, it describes also that Leibel's family has filed suit against the police department for the incident. Now, in this case, the police department had already instituted a voluntary registry for those with disabilities. Again, quoting from the article. In November, it implemented a voluntary registry program for individuals with autism, Alzheimer's, bipolar disorder, panic disorders, and schizophrenia. Each diagnosis corresponded to a different colored wristband, which the department asked registry members to wear for self-identification. Leibel's mother, Danielle, was angered by the proposal. "I think it's disgusting that you have to label someone with a disability with a special mark so they don't have to live in fear from being hurt by the police," she said. Will Goona, a representative for the ACLU, agreed. People with disabilities shouldn't have to broadcast their diagnosis to the world just because police officers have insufficient training. A better solution would be to have special wristbands for officers who've found to be engaged in excessive use of force, so the public knows who they're dealing with. So in this article, we can clearly see, this registry didn't work. Now, is it because Leibel wasn't wearing his colored wristband? Or because the officer in question acted with unnecessary and heavy-handed force? What's to prevent an officer from either ignoring the wristband, which can be done with easy excuses such as, "I wasn't sure if it was a legit wristband or one from a charity or something," or he had it behind him, or "I just didn't see it"? Or was this being more brutal because of the disability the wristband represents? Comparing colored wristbands to medical bracelets in this instance is a flawed exercise. Medical bracelets are there in case a patient is unconscious or otherwise unable to communicate vital and life-saving information to an EMT, nurse, or doctor. It's not used when someone can communicate. Also, medical personnel don't have to memorize or keep a guide of what color identifies a specific disability regarding medical wristbands. Voluntary registries and databases put the burden of inclusivity and equality upon those with disabilities instead of those who are causing the problem in the first place. Just like the plastic straw band fad we saw pop up last year. But that's a discussion for another time. So, what would these bracelets look like? And how can we get people to back them? Well, according to an article from the news station WJIA back in 2016, a pair of brothers who are autistic started a national registry organization for autistics called Autism FYI. From the article, 27-year-old Brad Benjamin and his brother, 26-year-old Kenny, are working hard on a project in their parents' home where they live. They hope this project could literally save a life like their own. The reason why we are excited about this is because this way people would never fear about people with Asperger's and autism anymore, says Kenny Benjamin. The Benjamin brothers are among an estimated 3.5 million Americans who are on the autism spectrum. They and their parents, Joyce and James Benjamin, have formed a first-ever National Autism Registry that works specifically with first responders. We are trying to give the officers a heads up on what they're dealing with and train them on how they can deal with it, says Joyce Benjamin. Registry members get a wearable USB device adorned with the autism emblem of a puzzle piece in a yield sign, which gives officers critical information about the person they're dealing with. The Benjamins want to avoid recent cases in which people on the spectrum have been unnecessarily hurt during encounters with police. Joyce Benjamin says, "My oldest, if he gets anxious, he may get combative just out of fear. People on the spectrum can be sensitive to light, noise, and touch, can have trouble recognizing social cues, and when confronted, anxiety can spike. These are all potential problems with interacting with police. People fear what they don't understand about us autistic people," says Kenny Benjamin. And all that was from the article. So let's talk about this a little bit. Their local police department is passing out registry decals and also claiming to educate the officers on how to communicate with autistic individuals. And to be fair, the registry is currently optional and families can opt out at any time, though there was no word on how any collected data was disposed of, or how quickly it is deleted, or how to verify removal. None of that is actually presented in the article, nor on the website. This article is deceptive, however. Kenny and James are not actually the leaders of this project. They are program assistants, and their parents are the CEO and COO of Autism FYI. If you read the bio information about the board members, followed by the Benjamin brothers information, you'll find something interesting. Everyone else has their academic, business, and professional experience listed first. But for Kenny and James, their ages are listed first, followed by emotional and personal characteristics. How odd. Don't be mistaken, I get that for some individuals, managing a nonprofit is difficult, yet Kenny and James seem to be relegated to, at best, figureheads and at worst, tokens. Kenny and James want people to not fear autistics. This is a laudable goal. But gentlemen, Kenny and James, why do they fear us in the first place? Based on the article and the quote from Kenny, they fear us because they do not understand us. So if understanding and education is the goal, why create a national registry with USB bracelets? I guess I see somewhat, but I'm failing to see how this device will keep us safe. Maybe that's due to my own bias and personal experience with disclosure. For many of us who have learned to mask or cloak our autistic traits, for however detrimental to our own psyches, and don't worry, there's an episode about masking coming up later in the year, for however detrimental this is, it gives us control. Power over who is permitted to know and who is not. And while one could argue that in some situations this could be avoided if the unsuspecting individual were aware that someone was autistic, the same argument could be made about covert and veiled discrimination and bigotry. Wearing a bracelet with a puzzle piece on it that also contains my personal and medical information in a digital format that is also saved in a nationally accessible database doesn't seem to solve or even mitigate the side effects from no longer having the power of disclosure. The following is from a great editorial at NOS magazine titled Autism Registries are Dangerous. The purposes of autism registries are to track diagnosis rates to ensure that services for autistic people are distributed correctly, or to help police respond to incidents involving autistic people. However, if the data fall into the wrong hands, registries can be used to further stigma against autistic people. They can be used to profile autistic people as dangerous. They can also mark us as unfit for employment, parenthood, or full participation in our communities. This stigma is particularly concerning when police forces with a history of hostility towards autistic and other disabled people have access to that data. Police have historically had a violent relationship with disabled people, especially black and brown disabled people. Providing the police with even more information about vulnerable populations could put autistic people even more at risk. In a political climate in which people are increasingly aware of police violence and its effects on vulnerable groups, it is morally unacceptable to give information to law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement agencies are not accountable. Police can be taught de-escalation without relying on registries that will place autistic people at risk. Again, that's from NOS Magazine, a really good editorial, but I want to continue a little bit and talk more about this. On the Neurologic Facebook page, I started an unofficial poll about, I would say, a few months ago, asking about registries and asking that, as an autistic, do you approve of such a measure? Would you voluntarily sign up for a registry or database, or are you against it entirely? 90% of respondents were against registries. And I'd like to read some comments from the poll itself, because these are really well thought out and put together and establish a reasoning of why people are mostly against these registries. Here's one. I'm not in favor of autism registries, mostly because I worry about the privacy implications, as well as any discrimination that may result. Who controls access to this list? Will it be just police, fire, EMTs, or will it be expanded to potential employers, etc.? Here's another one. The idea of a registry for any disability strikes me as extremely terrifying. And were there one, I would decline to be on it if possible. Furthermore, law enforcement shouldn't need that much help to not shoot someone. If someone isn't a physical threat, they shouldn't shoot. If someone isn't a physical threat, they shouldn't shoot. If officers are in greater danger because of not shooting early, too bad. Officers sign up for a dangerous job knowing that responsibility exists. The common person on the street doesn't. Effects to not shoot innocent civilians will not likely be aided by knowledge of a disability. Here's another one, and this one's actually for the registries. I personally brought the TMH, or Take Me Home program, to our county on behalf of my own children who are both diagnosed with autism. It is a voluntary registry for your loved ones who may be nonverbal, have developmental disabilities, or your elderly loved ones who may become confused and wander and not remember where they live. It is a tool to help law enforcement identify your loved one and get them home faster. That is all. If you are someone that is high functioning, verbal, etc., then you would not need to be on this registry. And finally, the last comment. I think this is another area where the spectrum width of autism works against the community. My youngest has elopement behaviors, and to mitigate against timely response should she run away, we have her pictures and her phone numbers on file at the police station. She is unable to return home on her own and unable to communicate who she is or where she lives or who her parents are. I realize this is a complete different scenario than a centralized multi-agency database, but I think it illustrates how the width of the spectrum can encourage one-size-fits-all solutions. So these are all pretty good comments. I think it's a small sample of the larger size of people, but it seems to be a common thread that most people are against registries, with a couple of people who are parents who feel rather differently about this. Keep in mind that being against registries isn't the same as being against parents keeping their child's information on file with the local police department. A national registry has much different implications than the current status quo, which is heavily opt-in and requires initiation on the part of the family and or the person. Now, you should also note that this isn't Autism FYI's only project. They are also working on developing and constructing their own intentional community. But what's an intentional community, you ask? An intentional community is, generally speaking, a gated area where those with disabilities, in this case autistics who need intermediate to significant supports, live exclusively, fenced off from the greater regional area and community, and subsequently their diversity. Autism FYI is calling it Spectrum Heights, a name on its own that is mildly creative with a side of milquetoasty suburban trope, and on their site we'll have the following. Quote, "This will be a neighborhood and community for independent adults with autism and their aging family members and companions. Adults with autism will learn to navigate adulthood and independence from their parents and family, as well as from a community that has lived with autism. The aging members will get to enjoy seeing their children gain independence as well as receive support. Supportive technology and staff will help this transition for all members." Now, it sounds downright enticing, doesn't it? A place to live, a community of people like ourselves, along with supporters to ensure a quality life. So what could be the problem with intentional communities? Well, for one thing, these privately funded, decentralized, and gated living areas resemble modern-age institutions, where it's no longer a daunting brick building, but rows of small homes and/or apartments, with decisions made by non-disabled individuals and family members about what the persons in the intentional community are allowed to do. Being enclosed in a community only surrounded by those who, having been deemed by societal and medical experts, are like you, based upon lack of ability, is terribly limiting. While living in a neighborhood or apartment complex with nothing but other autistics may have an appeal of common understanding, it limits the neurodiversity of that living space. It limits diversity of experience. Who gets to live here? Who is excluded? The limitations of a physical barrier, a wall and a locked gate, also lend themselves to a controlled life. It's an admittedly easy solution to behaviors such as wandering or elopement or fleeing, but fails to deconstruct the why, the reason behind them. It limits freedom of movement, freedom of socialization with others outside the community, and the feeling of being part of something larger. Behind a wall, the world feels smaller. Are you allowed to leave your home at 10:15 p.m. to go to the grocery store because you're craving some snacks? Can you walk out at any time, like most people are able to, for just a simple walk? Combined with guards, care attendants, coordinators, and other staff, a sense of privacy is almost always lost. Someone is consistently involved in your personal being, your personal business. You're never truly alone, unsupervised, unobserved, unwatched, unmonitored. And through biological and digital means, your whereabouts, activities, movements, functions, even possibly your medical status, are constantly being recorded for others to process and analyze. The most private moments of your life, now no longer private and not under your control. Who is watching? Where is that data kept? Are you allowed to see that information? Intentional communities that are not led by autistics, or at the very least led by a coalition of individuals with and without disabilities, a cooperative perhaps, are not communities, but quarantined compounds. The history of institutions has proven this fact. We've had less than a century of inclusion, yet here we are, regurgitating that age-old concept into a shiny new package, pretending that this is somehow a new, innovative, and positive approach. And why not? The intentions behind such initiatives are determined to be good by most of society. So naturally, the creation of such places is inherently good and favorable. Now, if that wasn't enough, that intentional communities were intentionally segregated, the schools we attend are adopting the practice of using seclusion rooms. For those of you not familiar, seclusion rooms supposedly start out as a calm, quiet, STEM-friendly room for students with disabilities to voluntarily use as a way to mitigate meltdowns from being overwhelmed in the classroom. Now, like most initiatives for those with disabilities, seclusion rooms have become perverted into a form of temporary, solitary confinement. A cruel, barbaric, and psychologically torturous punishment used as a consequence for nearly any form of conduct, noncompliance, or emotional display. One of our own, a 13-year-old autistic activist named Alex Campbell, is trying to change that by closing seclusion rooms in schools. From the article found on NBCnews.com. Alex Campbell was just 7 years old when he says his principal dragged him down the hall to the school's crisis room. Administrators reserved the room, a converted storage closet, for children who acted out. He still remembers the black painted walls, the small window he was too short to reach, the sound of a desk scraping across the floor as it was pushed in front of the door to make sure he just couldn't get out. Alex, who has autism spectrum disorder, says he was taken there more than a half dozen times in first grade for behaviors such as ripping up paper or refusing to follow instructions in class. The room was supposed to calm him down. Instead, it terrified him. When I asked for help or asked if anyone was still there, nobody would answer, Alex said. I felt alone. I felt scared. According to the latest data collected by the U.S. Department of Education, public school districts are reporting restraining or secluding over 120,000 students during the 2015 through 2016 school year, most of them children with disabilities. Families and advocates have documented cases of students being pinned down, strapped to their wheelchairs, handcuffed, or restrained in other ways. Both practices, experts say, can traumatize children and may lead to severe injuries, even death. Alex is determined to close the seclusion rooms for good. Last week, the 13-year-old told his story to legislators, congressional staff, and advocates to mark the introduction of the Keeping All Students Safe Act, a bill that would bar the use of seclusion and significantly curtail the use of restraints in schools that receive federal funds. No federal law currently regulates the use of such practices on students. No laws required school administrators to tell his parents what was happening. Alex says the principal warned him that if he said anything, he would spend the rest of the year locked in the room. According to a recent analysis published by the Autism National Committee, only 28 states provide meaningful protections against restraint and seclusion for children, including those with disabilities. Kurt Decker, executive director of the National Disability Rights Network, said that teachers and administrators are more likely to isolate or restrain difficult children when they are not provided with training and resources. Although children with disabilities represent only 12% of students enrolled in public schools, they made up 71% of all students restrained and 66% of all those secluded, according to the Education Department data for the 2015 through 2016 school year. Black students are also disproportionately restrained and secluded. Sometimes such practices can severely injure or even kill the children subjected to them. In Alex's case, a state investigation found that the school didn't violate protocol or his rights by restraining or secluding him. A representative of the school said that the crisis room was removed 5 years ago. Overall, Alex would be subjected to seclusion and restraint, including to the point of injury, over a dozen times in at least 4 different schools, his parents say, before they found a program that met his needs. When Alex stepped up to the podium and looked out at the 40-odd people who gathered to hear him speak, he introduced himself as a self-advocate and began to tell his story in a clear and steady voice. "There was a time when I did not want to go to sleep at night," he said. "I did not want to sleep because I knew I had to wake up in the morning. I remember praying and hoping that I would not wake up. But my prayers were not answered and the cycle continued. I believe that it is important that we must put a stop to restraint, seclusion, and abuse in schools. It can be changed, and it needs to be changed." Now, in the article, there is discussion about the limited and often inadequate resources for teachers, specifically those teaching special needs classes, and how that limitation results in seclusion and restraint. And look, while that makes sense on some level, it doesn't when addressing basic human rights. Students, especially those with disabilities, don't have the same rights as adults do. It's hard to sue a school district as a student or even hold it accountable for such clearly horrible actions. If school districts have the resources to build a solitary confinement room, they have the resources to secure training and proper curriculum for teachers. Alex thinks this is a start, but not enough. And he's absolutely right. It's abundantly clear that a neurotypical child would never have been treated in this way, in such routine and repeated fashion. Not having proper training or resources? That's no excuse for treating a child, a human being, worse than you treat your dog. Of course, with modern age come modern solutions, and as we aim to take down seclusion rooms and registries, a new threat appears on the horizon. Do you hear it? Can you see it? Flying in the air, quieter than a plane, watching from a height out of most people's visual range. No, it's not a hive of mosquitoes. It's a drone. Yes, drones, to track autistics who wander. Droney the Drone, your friendly neighborhood automated unmanned aircraft, is here to keep a spying eye on you. From an article at disabilityscoop.com, a pilot program will use state funding to purchase a drone that police can use to help locate people with autism and others at risk of wandering if they go missing. The technology is provided by Project Lifesaver, which will provide tracking devices for those with cognitive disorders. The device can be placed on a person's foot or ankle. Working with 911, deputies will be able to find the person using a frequency emitted from the device. The transmitter costs $325, although exceptions can be made for those unable to afford them. The seed money will go to the purchase of a drone and the training required involving 2 deputies. Okay, on the surface this seems efficient. A tracking device that can turn itself on if it leaves a certain facility or area, and can be followed by a drone. Drones are faster and navigate more quickly than current search methods, so when focused solely on the issue of finding a missing person, this actually makes sense. But it will also require attaching a transmitter to a foot or ankle. You know, like we currently do for convicted criminals serving their time on house arrest. And like being on house arrest, if you leave your home, you'll automatically be tracked wherever you go by Droney. This project, of course, is currently voluntary, just like the registry, just like intentional communities. However, in similar style to seclusion rooms, this could become the de facto solution to supervise autistic children. At what age do we attach an ankle bracelet to a child? At what point do we explain that we've stopped looking for ways to prevent wandering that take into consideration the person who is wandering? Do we even bother to find out why they're wandering? Or is it just easier to throw privacy out the window in favor of surveillance? The argument here is that this will, in theory, prevent deaths of autistics, with citations covering drownings, running into traffic, getting hit by a car, etc., etc. And it is an argument. It truly is. It is truly an argument. But it's one that implies autistics cannot be communicated with on a certain level, and need to be treated like a pet instead of a person. Whose fault is it when society, educators, relatives, even your own parents give up on having genuine communication with you? Where will this end up? I am all for treatment and protection of autistic children, especially from bullying, discrimination, and abuse. Autistic children grow up into autistic adults, and the way they grow up will shape their actions later in life. Registries, isolated communities, solitary confinement, and 24/7 tracking, this all teaches an autistic child that they have little to no autonomy, little freedom to make their own decisions, and no semblance of privacy. Ironically, such concepts are being touted as essential life skills for autistic adults. Autistic adults need to be able to make their own decisions, they say. Without social skills and critical thinking skills, they are vulnerable to scammers, thieves, and abusers. They must be taught these skills because they were born without them, and parents need to be secure enough to know that their child can safely navigate the world after they die. To the average person, being taught as a child to obey, to do what they're told, or face horrific and life-altering consequences, then be told later on in life to do the exact opposite when they're adults. Well, wouldn't an average person have a meltdown about that? I have no answer here, no penultimate solution that can just snap into place and make everything better for everyone. I do know that these actions are leading us down the wrong path, away from inclusion, acceptance, and integration with our neurotypical neighbors, who wouldn't put up with being treated this way at all. But such analysis is never really considered. Modern technology will, of course, save the country from the irritating, the inconvenient, the difficult individuals like ourselves. As Kurt Vonnegut once wrote, so it goes. I'm Leo Jones, and this has been Neurologic. Neurologic is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. To view a copy of this license, visit creativecommons.org/by-nc-nd/4.0 or send a letter to Creative Commons, P.O. Box 1866, Mountain View, California 94042, USA. Neurologic uses the song Furious Freak, created by Kevin MacLeod, for its intro and outro music. Visit him at incompetech.com. Furious Freak is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license, creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. You can reach Leo Jones and Neurologic by email at neurologicpodcast@gmail.com.